Howdy, folks. Welcome back to another Storm Chasing Forecast show. I'm here joined by Coach Kyle Gillette. How you doing tonight?
Not too bad. It looks like you're doing pretty good out there at the
Yeah,
lake. We're going
mine.
to
Yeah,
be chatting a little bit about the forecast for that area on Monday.
yeah.
You'll be sampling in real time what we're feeling out there prior to
This
this
is
event.
this is the slight risk. We're right here,
Oh,
smack
very good.
dab in the slight risk. So, I am not
Yeah.
Gabriel Harbor. If you haven't noticed, we're switching things up a little bit tonight. Gabe said, "You know what? Why don't you go ahead and try hosting?" So this is my first host, my first time hosting, and this is Kyle's second show. So it's probably going to be rough, but we're going to get through it. I'm excited. There's a reason I'm up here. I'm up here chasing. We're out here going diving in the lake. There's Will. Will's doing some fishing. So yeah, we're just going to kind of wait. And I get a free forecast. I don't even have to look at the models anymore. I just get a free forecast from
There you
Kyle.
go.
So yeah, we're going to go over
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, we can go ahead and just jump right into this here.
Great.
The interesting thing about the forecast was that we kind of have two different modes, but they're actually rather similar as far as this. What we're discussing here is this kind of northern plains mode and the northeast mode. There's also a very small monsoonal mode way down there in parts of Arizona. We'll talk about that as well. But just in general, this kind of northern plains and northeast mode, both of these are going to be related to cold frontal passages and just some skinny areas of semi-okay dew points and some decent thermodynamics. We actually could have some pretty decent wind shear in place, especially across the northern plains, which makes things a little interesting. But much like my last forecast show, which was also up here for the northern plains, it's all about whether or not more than one or two ingredients are able to come together to kind of make this work out. And is things going to work out in terms of timing, in terms of cap, in terms of early convection? So there's a lot of moving parts to this forecast, but it certainly is not the best severe weather event that we've had. But this late in the season, you really got to take what you can get. And a lot of times, especially in the northern plains, August events can do pretty well. So I'll go ahead and start us off here on the northern plains event. This right here is a slight risk extending through eastern North Dakota, parts of northwest Minnesota, down into South Dakota, and then eventually down to the sand hills there of western Nebraska. And this is kind of going to be the main event. We're going to have the majority of the forcing across the cone is going to be focused here, and some of the better parameter space across the northern plains as well. Of course, I was also talking about a risk in the northeast, and this is just a small marginal risk that it pretty much extends to parts of Pennsylvania, up the coast into New Hampshire and Vermont. This is going to be your classic summer northeast event. You've got a cold front swinging through, and this is going to be possibly more of an earlier day event, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Then we also have this kind of monsoonal threat down here in parts of Arizona. This, of course, is going to be mostly related to, are we going to be able to create strong enough downbursts that have severe winds associated with them? So again, very monsoonal-like convection there. And again, biggest risk, slight risk on the northern plains. We do have a 2% tornado risk in that slight area up there in the Dakotas and Minnesota. So that's our big tornado threat for Monday. We do have kind of the slight, if you will, for wind, and you can see also that threat down there in Arizona being highlighted for wind as well as in the northeast. And then the primary hail threats are going to be up into the Dakotas, Minnesota, and down into Nebraska.
Sweet. Awesome. So I'm excited to look into why they issued this, what potential we have for that big tornado risk.
Yeah, we're going to keep with that one. And the funny thing is, we'll take a look at the kinematics here. So this is going into the 500 millibar wind. This is an example of a kinematic pattern this late in the year where if we really had the really good August thermos that you'd expect to have this time of year with all the heat and humidity, maybe we could be talking about a different threat, because we actually have quite a bit of wind associated with this. So we're going to be focused, of course, on that trough that's ejecting from parts of the northern U.S. Rockies across pretty much the Canada-U.S. border into the northern plains. And that troughing is going to bring us some forcing here. So we can watch this kind of swing through parts of the northwest through Montana. It's going to continue to eject over to that right there is honestly, I don't know if you should waste your time on the severe weather threat if you're able to bag those. That is a better intercept, if you will.
There we go.
Yeah, very good.
Big old
So
pipe.
we'll see how this turns out for us, because we have a few things coming together, but it's not going to be as easy as that was right there. Yeah, we have this kind of trough ejecting from the northwest out onto the northern plains. You can see we've got a nice belt of flow here, plus 50 knot flow into the Dakotas and Minnesota. We also have another trough over the northeast, and you can see that a positively tilted trough becoming almost neutral by the time it swings through New England there up into Maine. But yeah, we also have some 50 knot flow maybe in there as well as it crosses through New York and into Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. We also have some flow there. And one of the big questions, if we go back to the Northern Plains target, is the fact that we have multiple areas of little lift that's going to be moving through parts of the Northern Plains and Minnesota throughout the earlier parts of this event. So this is going to possibly lead to some elevated convection before the real show starts, which is going to be along the cold front later into the evening. You could also possibly say the same in the Northeast, but that's very typical of the Northeast, where we have multiple rounds of convection moving through along the cold front and ahead of the cold front, and you can see that here with that trough. And anytime you see height vorticity, where those iso heights are kind of dipping down here and we see that kind of trough shape, especially those little small areas where we might have a dip in the height lines, that's showing us we probably are going to have some amount of lift there that might be supporting convection. And the fact that we're seeing some of that before the main area of convection moves through means we might have some earlier convection that might be contaminating our atmosphere. We can look at the temperature here at the surface just for kind of a basic overview of what things look like. You can see two primary low pressure systems separated by this high over the Great Lakes. You've got one over here in the northeast and a very subtle, small, warm sector with a cold front behind it that's going to be sweeping through northeast and into New England. And then we also have this kind of semi-common low ejection coming here from pretty much Wyoming out onto the northern and central plains. And it kind of does this kind of double barrel split sort of deal as it tries to eject further into the Midwest and into the Great Lakes and up into Ontario as well. And I typically don't have a lot of good experience with those type of events. They seem pretty disorganized at the surface, and you might even be able to make that out here in the surface winds, how we kind of just have this little bit of an odd surface pattern here, especially as we get into around initiation time. You can clearly see the cold front there as well. That'll be our main forcing mechanism.
I want to vomit whenever I look at that surface pattern. It is just horrible. They can get them done, but it's one of those things. Shear pretty anomalous, so we'll have to see what happens, but those are going to be the biggest concern. I'm sure you're going to get into that. I'd love for you to explain why those low-level thermals are the way they are for today.
Yeah, and then for the real issue here, and you can actually probably see some of this just looking at the temperature field. Yeah, there's the cold front there. If we back up a little bit, you might see these little anomalies in the temperature field where it appears cooler, and that's actually a sign to us that there might be convection there. And you can also maybe see that at times in the dew point field as well. So again, this is just CONUS dew point. You can see this is going into 18Z, 19Z, and maybe there's some areas of convection that are moving through even before we have the main initiation. You can see the cold front finally wiping through the Midwest there. We'll take a look at SIMREF here in more detail in just a moment, but you do have a decent warm sector here. Dew points are somewhat on the lower side, just above that 60 mark. So it's not excellent, but it might be enough to get the job done. But then further in the Northeast, you actually have some decent dews. You're actually making it up well into the 60s, perhaps pushing 70 there as well, with along that cold front. So this might end up with sort of that typical kind of bimodal, maybe some more isolated clusters before you get to the cold front later on. And so that's going to be the case there. If we just take a quick look at our instability, kind of tying everything together thermodynamically, we start out. This is going in from the kind of overnight hours of Sunday night into Monday morning. You'll notice there's already some instability on the northern plains, and then we have those disturbances moving over the top of this. We're going to have convection moving through the risk area before that cold front arrives. And that's pretty much the main issue with our low-level thermals. There's a couple more components that we'll talk about in a moment, but we rebuild that cape right before that cold front swings through. And you see we kind of rebuild that cape right as we get close to 0Z. So this is likely also a later initiation time. Northern plains as well. We have a decent amount of instability there in southern Arizona, which is going to be associated with that severe weather risk there. And across the Northeast, you also have this, it's not a terribly rigorous warm sector, but you do have a little bit of instability, of course, ahead of that cold front in the Northeast. And as you were saying, shear is going to be a big deal here for us as we go through parts of Monday for the northern plains. We have quite a bit of, this is 0.6 kilometer shear, so this is essentially most of what the storm is going to be feeling. And you'll notice that we have pretty anomalous shear here, especially as we get into parts of eastern North Dakota and northwest Minnesota. This is around initiation time, so right along that cold front, we might have a pretty good belt of shear, and this is going to be important for organizing convection if it's able to initiate correctly. We also have a little bit of shear down in Arizona that might help, not necessarily create organized supercellular convection, but maybe help organize more of a multi-cell cluster sort of organization. We also have some pretty decent deep layer flow and shear over the northeast head of that cold front as well. So we're looking at organized convection in the sense of not necessarily popcorn. We're probably in this more multi-cell part of the spectrum, but on the northern plains, we could be looking at some better chances for actual supercellular convection, but there's a couple caveats to that, and we can go ahead and get into that now, unless you've got any questions at this point, Steve.
Yeah, so some questions I was going to ask is, if we're seeing supercell potential up here in the northern plains, in that Fargo, up to Grand Forks, over to Bemidji area, that big little triangle, and perhaps further north, what do you think they're going to look like? Are they going to be photogenic? If the tornado threat's pretty low, if it can happen, it'll happen, but we're mainly looking at wind and hail, but how's the structure? Is there going to be a structure fest? Because I know there's those big looping photographs. Are we going to get a mound city structure, or are we just going to get a bunch of cold frontal slop? So I'm curious to see what you say.
Yeah, so right before I get into that, I just want to show just to get context for everybody on what the sim ref might look like, and then we'll pull a few soundings and kind of get to that. And so this is going back into Sunday night here and going through Monday morning, and you'll notice this is starting out Monday morning at 12Z. We've got quite a bit of convection. Of course, according to the HER, this one particular run of the HER there, this is the 0Z HER, showing us that we do have some pretty widespread convection over eastern North Dakota, and then eventually evolving to the east there in parts of western Minnesota. You can also see some of this lingering through South Dakota as well. So this is into 18Z now, where we have this widespread convection. Remember, it's not just raining here. There's also going to be cloud cover associated with this. So we're really not living up to the full potential that we could have if we had nice clear skies underneath that August sunshine. So we're going to be really limiting the amount of destabilization we can have. So that's going to really work on harming the ability for those low-level thermos to strengthen throughout the day. So we're not going to have as much 3 cape as we might be able to achieve, especially with some of the lower dew points that we might have. We also have a problem of a little bit of a cap that's associated with a warm layer moving through pretty much a 600 to 700 millibar range. And so all of these things combined are really hurting our low-level thermodynamics. That makes it hard to get good, sustained supercell convection despite the wind shear we might have. So this is at 21Z here, and I'm just going to pluck a few soundings. So this is pretty much on US 2 between Bemidji and Grand Forks. And even though this photograph is a little wonky at this particular time, what you see here is that we actually do have a fairly decent amount of shear in general in this profile. But you'll notice that this low-level thermodynamic profile is kind of weird. We might have some convective contamination at that hour still. And it's going to be really hard to even pull a sounding in here because there's so much convection in the way on this particular run. So I'm going to go a little further to the south and east here and maybe get a bit of a cleaner profile. So there's that maybe better photograph here, that you have that large curvature in the low levels, and you have a little bit of deep layer shear here. This is getting out to 60 knots in that pretty much 9 to 12 kilometer range. That's pretty good. We have some deep layer shear. We have large stream-wise low-level shear, and that's a nice looking kinematic profile. But if we take a gander over here, this is not looking as nice. Maybe we're able to warm up quite a bit here and actually obtain some decent lapse rates, but because that low-level moisture is rather pathetic for this time of year in the low 60s, we're not able to bring that temperature dew point depression together, and you need that to build strong low-level instability. You also have that warm layer that's hurting things between 700 and 600 millibars. Because of that, LCLs are quite high off the ground. You have a large distance between the LCL and the LFC, and remember that means the larger distance between those two levels, the more that cold front really needs to force air to rise instead of just the natural convection that we might have from the instability. So what do I think storms will look like here? You can kind of just look at what the HER has here for a general idea. We have, and we can even look through some other cams here while we're doing this. Yeah, there might be some updraft helicity tracks kind of popping up here and there, but in general, this is pretty messy mode. And of course, we want to take the RRFS with a big grain of salt here as far as its intensity. Its placement might be okay, but definitely don't take its intensity as truth. But looking through all of these, the main thing that we're seeing is the consistent signal. Of course, a couple of these ARWs might look okay, but the point is that we have this consistent signal for a mess. And this is going to be just clustered convection. Embedded within that, we might be able to obtain supercell structures. But when we're looking for something that's photogenic, typically we're looking for something that is generally by itself or only with a few storms around it, that's got good access to open air. And when you have so many different things that could be inhibiting low-level instability, you're not really going to be able to help the stretching of low-level vorticity in a storm's updraft. So that's going to help reduce the tornado threat. So in general, we might end up with some form of embedded supercell characteristics just because of the shear that we have. But as far as good-looking chaseable super, this, I'll say this way, today does not have me excited for what I would expect for a Northern Plains severe weather setup in August. And just in recent history, we think of Mound City. This just does not have the thermodynamic or really even synoptic characteristics of such an event, just because of the amount of mess that we're likely to see from this.
Great explanation. I love that. There's one thing I wanted to ask. You want to look at that just north of Minnesota in that Canada area, because I was noticing that's going to be a target there. There's some streaks there, and if you look, you got to look at the SIG-TOR, man. You take a look at this updraft listy tracks. It's literally April 27, 2011, all over again.
All over again. Oh, dear Lord. Yeah, so this is another example, right, where you have really nice kinematics here, really good photograph, gigantic photograph, and then something is wrong over here in the thermodynamics. However, this is also getting a little bit later into the evening. And in this case, you still have this kind of morning or early afternoon convection moving through, but because shear is getting better the further north you go, the closer you get to the trough, you're going to have a little bit better chances of obtaining that better photograph and maybe getting something going. But you'll also notice here that's also a little bit closer to the location of that kind of secondary surface low. So some of that surface turning is going to be a little bit stronger. Some of that low-level advection is going to be a little bit stronger. So maybe we're able to obtain some slightly higher dew points up in that area, and maybe the wrap is trying to hint at some of that here. So up in this area, probably still a mess. Good luck chasing in this region here. I don't know how many roads are actually in here. You'd probably do a lot of portaging with a canoe, but the environment is definitely a little bit better the further north you go as you get into that better shear. But in general, this whole northern target just seems to be dealing with that early mess, the pre-initiation convection that's going to be moving through, contaminating the environment.
All right, great. I got to look at the outline because I don't know if I'm supposed to do a weather front promotion. I am not a good salesman. That should have been at the beginning, but I'll go ahead and do that now. This is the weather front. It is fantastic. All right, is that all you have up here for the Northern Plains?
Yeah, for the most part, it is a pretty straightforward event. Thermos aren't going to be too great, so they could be better. Shear looks pretty good, but as always in severe weather forecasting and chasing, it seems to be there's just always one thing that seems to be off. But in this case, we might have multiple things that are out of whack between timing and thermos and all sorts of different things. But there are a few other threat areas, as we've discussed. So we'll transition to the northeast now. And what we're really focusing on here is potentially the risk for some more of those damaging winds. We didn't see a tornado threat or a hail threat here from the SPC, but we do have the opportunity for perhaps some stronger winds. And this is not anything out of the ordinary for the Northeast and New England for this time of year. Essentially what we're going to be dealing with, and just for context, I'm going to run back to our surface pattern here. What you'll notice in the Northeast is this kind of low that's going to be moving from the pretty much west to east and eventually northeast here, pretty much up the border with Canada. And we have this trailing cold front that's going to be moving pretty much west to east generally, and it's going to be going through parts of the area pretty early. So I'll back us up here. This is actually 12Z, and you can see that front is pretty much already through parts of the risk area by this point, or approaching the western part of the risk area, and then translating to the east. As we get into pretty much 21Z, we're probably already seeing that threat transition up into parts of New Hampshire, Vermont, and into Maine, and then eventually out of the area by the time we get into the later evening. So this is going to be a earlier event, and because of that, we're not going to see as much destabilization as we might see if this was a little bit later in the evening. But also this time of year, we're not necessarily requiring all that much destabilization with this particular type of event. And I may have plucked that there in in the middle of a thunderstorm. I'll go back to the SimRef and we'll actually examine some of this. And again, you'll see some of the earlier timing here. So this is going through the morning. There's morning convection moving through. Some of these might have some stronger downbursts associated with them just because we have so much shear. Because of that amount of flow that we have aloft, any downdraft is going to grab onto some of that stronger wind and transport it down to the ground. And that's where those strong downdrafts typically come from. And as we go throughout the morning, you can see maybe we're developing some convection here in parts of eastern New York, and then that's going to eventually translate to the east. And then we have additional development, possibly as we go into parts of the early afternoon. Further to the south, you can see that extending through New Jersey, maybe as far south as northern Virginia. Not necessarily a part of the primary weather from the SPC, but you can see that kind of a trailing boundary of convection all the way down into the Carolinas even as well. Some of the better shear, though, to the north, and that's where that better threat for perhaps some of those strong winds will be derived from. But if we take a look at one of these soundings in here, and I might have to poke around to find a decent one, but you can see we destabilize here. We have some low LFCs. They're pretty much right attached to the LCL, assuming that parcel is going to rise, condensate, and essentially instantly become freely buoyant. So we have some decent instability here. Something over 1,000 joules isn't too bad. Because we have this kind of separation between our temperature and the dew point here in the lower levels, that means we're perhaps going to see some cooling of those downdrafts as they fall. That's going to help them become a little bit stronger. And of course, they're going to pull on that wind aloft, bring down some strong downdrafts. We actually have decent shear profile here. And so this is where I'm not totally convinced that we don't see transient supercell structures because of this wind profile. I think that because of the earlier convection, we're going to have some destabilization issues, but that's not uncommon in the Northeast, and typically the Northeast can still squeeze a few very small, weak circulations out of that. And you can see maybe the HERS hinting at some of those kidney bean shapes, which is maybe a testament to some simulated supercell sort of structures here. This is almost like a TC, a tropical cyclone-like thermodynamic profile here, which of course is not the case, but that's really what it's reminding me of in a way. And then we have these decent shear profiles. Yeah, I think that up here, if you're able to find decent terrain up in the mountains in New Hampshire and Vermont and all that, and maybe there's some transient supercell structures up where that shear's a little bit better, just for the sake of fun, let's look at some of the big parameters here, the SIGTOR, and you can see, yeah, maybe there's a few transient areas where we might have some thermodynamic and kinematic overlap here that might be supportive of maybe a transient supercell structure. This is the supercell composite, maybe the same thing, though I will say that the primary threat is likely going to be a downdraft threat. You're going to have a lot of those storms going up along the cold front. Things are going to be pretty messy, moving pretty quick. That's what I would say for the Northeast. And then as far the threat down in the Southwest is pretty straightforward, right? This is just a monsoonal event where we have convection popping up as we go into the afternoon and evening. As we destabilize that atmosphere, you'll notice here we actually do have convection going west to east, and that's because we're pretty much smack dab in the middle of the ridge here. So flow is reversed on the bottom of the ridge compared to what we'd usually be used to here in the northern hemisphere. So we're actually going east to west in this particular environment. And you can see that here. Pretty much we're used to the photograph always extending to the right of center. In this case, it's all going to the left of center. Clearly, you can see why we have that risk for strong downdrafts, because we have that very large inverted V profile here, very high LCLs. And of course, if you're a lightning photographer, this might be the place to be for tomorrow, for Monday, because we have this really good threat of actually seeing convection and perhaps some stronger convection. But otherwise, yeah, this is more or less a pretty straightforward August severe weather setup. Nothing too crazy. I wish it was Mound City because I could use one of those again. But yeah, overall, this is pretty straightforward, pretty normal for all sectors of the country here.
Yeah, if I could be anywhere, I'd be down there monsoon chasing. It looks like a lot of fun. It's been a goal of mine to get down.
To be honest, I think I would agree with that. I still have to do monsooning, but I think that just given the way that the other two events are going to work out, of course, if you're in the area, might as well. Yeah. But yeah, I definitely think Southwest would be the place to be.
So where do you think has the best potential for tornadoes, and especially just in the northern risk, would you say?
I definitely think that if you're able to get a storm that is on the leading edge of, and the Her might have hinted at this a little bit, if you're able to get some kind of organized cell that's in the leading edge of some of this mess, or maybe down at the tail of a mess that's moving through, I would say pretty much the triangle Grand Forks, Bemidji to Fargo. However, I wouldn't be surprised if you do get action further north just because you're closer to that shear. Like I said before, though, I'm not totally convinced that there is a zero tornado threat in New England and the Northeast. I think that if you're actually able to get a maybe semi-discrete cell that's able to really feel the instability and feel that shear, I don't see why it doesn't become supercellular and perhaps even tornadic. I don't think there's going to be anything too strong and really not too photogenic, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see at least something particularly along where the cold front is bowing into parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine.
Yeah, I agree. I think those profiles up there definitely have some potential. Those steeper low-level laps are very tropical, moist, as you mentioned, and that shear is pretty classic for the Northeast there. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a 2% up there. But yeah. All right, we got a shameless plug right here.
Shameless plug.
This is Wilza. He's the creator of the hit Roblox game Twisted, where he's working on Severity now. It's going to be the next big storm chasing game, ultra realistic, planning to release sometime this year. So check that out if you want to get on Roblox and play that. It's going to be a fantastic game. We're really excited. Hoping to maybe do something with Storm Chaser coaching with that. Yeah, this is Will.
Yo.
Hey, Will. I don't think we've actually met before. So nice.
We have, actually. You remember that day in Killdeer last year? I think it was like August 3rd.
Oh my gosh, I forgot. I actually kind of forgot that day existed. To be
I know, because nothing happened, but I met you at the gas station.
I tried to erase that day. Oh. That's right. I forgot. Yeah, I forgot all about that. Yep. Gosh, that day sucked. I felt good about that day, driving out there. And then, we all kind of cried at Killdeer. Gosh.
And we are
bad memory. That's an example of an August day gone bad.
Remember to check out those links in the description below, and then watch another video.